Hey everyone, Nyx here, and welcome back to my WoW housing series. In the previous episode, we built this fancy Blood Elven office for the matron who runs this whole establishment that my house is based out of. But today, we're going to take things back into that undead style as I build a room for my tauren Death Knight here. I've got a whole empty stairway already set up, where my apothecary will be on the bottom floor, and my Death Knight on the top. Plan is to generally make a war room with personal rooms on the side, because this tauren was a war leader in both life and death, and I'll be talking about that as I go through the building process here and share some of her backstory. And I'm really eager to get started, so I'm going to jump in right away by laying out some structure for this place before we get into the actual decorating. As we begin building here, I'm going to talk a little bit about Rokara's backstory, sort of the character behind this build. She was born many decades ago at a time when the tauren tribes were much more scattered. They were dealing with the centaur, they were warring with each other, and she was a member of the Grim Totem tribe, raised to be brutal in combat and bring carnage to the battlefield. She proved herself quite the exceptional warrior as she grew up, and soon found herself put in a position where she was leading a war band. Basic structuring in, it actually took a bit longer than it usually does to do this sort of thing. Mainly because I had to go to Northrend and farm out some reagents to make this great. I'm trying to emulate sort of what you see in Icecrown Citadel and other undead areas where you'd have this grate that then you can see to a lower floor. I think that'll look really cool once my apothecary has her lab set up, because you'll be able to look down on all of that. But either way, it makes for a pretty nice aesthetic appearance. This may get changed in the future, but for now, I like how this looks. In general, this just took a bit because this room layout is complicated to work in. I'm trying not to duplicate my layouts too much. And if we go here, we could have ended up with a room very like this, with a centerpiece towards the back and along the central corridor, since we're dealing with so many of these square stairwell rooms. But I'm pretty happy with this instead. It would have just been a little too narrow if we had it divvied up like that. I wouldn't be able to get the side rooms in, but this way I can have an entrance that is pretty nice. With a door in here, you'll immediately clock onto this point of interest. For this war planning room, we got enough room on the sides. Then in these back two rooms, I feel like we actually have enough room for this to be a forge, a very like rune forge Death Knight sort of thing. Then of course, as always, a bedroom, because I like to have rooms for my characters to actually live in. It's nice for them to have a bit more of a personal space. So it's a bit of a complicated room layout. Of course, we use the scaling walls trick that I learned in the last episode, where if you bind your scale buttons to hotkeys, you can actually scale items that can't be scaled, like these walls and pillars. And I think it looks pretty nice for a start. Now, I already had to go to Dalaran to Northrend to farm some reagents, but that is far from the last reagent farming we're going to have to do, because I'm punishing myself, and this Death Knight's build is going to require a whole bunch of crafted items to really come together in a way that I want. So I'm going to have to get on that, and once I'm back with you, we'll be ready to start on the actual building process. On the battlefield, she brought victory over and over and over again, claiming territory and resources for the Grim Totem in this dark time. She even earned the name Darkhorn, because though her horns were bone white, they'd become darkened by the blood of the battlefield. Very edgy stuff. That took forever. I really wish wood gathering was, maybe a profession like archaeology or something, and there was a way to improve it, because I actually cut myself off after a certain point. If I'd gone for all of the braziers that I wanted to get, I probably would have been at that for several more hours just gathering lumber, and then dealing with all the other profession stuff, getting professions leveled, getting the reagents for them. It's a lot of work to use any profession equipment, which is a shame, because some of the best decor, and especially some of the best sort of undead themed decor, comes from professions. But I finally got the braziers I want, the little runic tablets I want, the anvil, all that good stuff, and while I was out there, I actually had a realization, and that is that if I'm already going to be holding off on doing the horde section of the house, and we're getting an increased room budget in Midnight, there's no reason for me to be doing the empty stairwell rooms for these rooms right here. I can actually just go ahead and delete this, and then on the second floor, which we are, just use a small square room. And then similarly on the first floor, another small square room for my apothecary's lair. And now I'll lose the cool like grate in the floor effect, but I wasn't totally sold on that anyway. Now I can save on decor budget on for the floor here. I have an easier room to work with just overall. The ceiling will be nicer. I can get flagstones down here, which will fit the theme much better. So all in all, it's just going to be a major improvement. I'm going to go ahead and rebuild the room layout that I had here and start getting some of these sort of basic details in, and I'll get back to you when I'm done. Eventually, she came to challenge the leader of her sect of the Grim Totem tribe, and in combat, severed his head from his shoulders, taking over her sort of branch of it. During her time as leader, though, she ended up having a daughter who she trained in the same brutal combat tradition she had been training in, despite her daughter's inclination towards more peaceful and positive action. Perhaps it was no surprise then when, one day, her daughter challenged her for leadership of the tribe, and Rokara too had her head severed from her shoulders. So it's been about a week. I've been busy traveling and with work, but it's given me a lot of time to reflect on the build as it's coming together so far, and while I like what I've got going with this sort of war room and especially this custom throne, I'm getting the feeling of it being a little cramped and that things could be better. And as much as I wanted to avoid making another room where it's a sort of hallway down the middle and then rooms on the side, the way that the ceiling gets vaulted in a medium room like this kind of just lends itself to that, especially if I want to fit the throne in well. So I'm going to redo the layout of the room, possibly redo the throne, and then I've got a few other ideas to enhance this as we move back into the building phase. I'm liking this open layout a bit better. It's very Death Knight inspired, it's very tauren inspired, but I still feel like there's something missing. Obviously I'm working in a constrained space, but I think I can do better. And I think in order to do better, I'm going to go take a look at Icecrown Citadel, Acaris, and some of the other Death Knight sort of Lich King-y locations, and sort of get a sense for what they have going on over there. Something I've noticed in a lot of Lich King and Death Knight spaces is they tend to have these very wide open sort of areas to the ground, and that could be really cool if I were to convert it back to that sort of two-story setup. The issue is then I wouldn't be able to use these sort of cobbled flooring, but maybe I could improvise something to make that work anyway. Yeah, we do see a lot of like open space here. You know, as we look into other areas, they are more denoted by scenery, it looks like. Well, like we've got plague barrels over here, and over here we've got stuff locked in frost, flames, that sort of thing. I wish we could get these braziers in the house so I wouldn't have to improvise something for that. Yeah, open spaces with sightlines blocked off by curtains that then determine the actual look in the space by what they have surrounding it. And then upstairs is pretty similar. It's less noticeable. I guess this is a fairly open forge area. I'm definitely going to be taking some inspiration from this section. And then the actual forges themselves get their own little sort of centerpieces. But okay, I think I'm getting a general feel. I'm getting some good inspiration out of this, some ideas of how I might be able to rework things. I'm going to go ahead though and head on over to Icecrown Citadel to take a look there. During ICC, what other fun things can we pick out here? Again, more of these cool braziers. That's why I wanted to farm up those brazier items. I knew that was a look that gets used a lot in these sort of Death Knight Lich King areas. Okay, let's brainstorm some things. So if I wanted to make a hanging platform above my apothecary's lair, that could be cool. I also wanted a private chamber in my apothecary's lair too, but that could be done by making a connecting room in the back, and then I can focus the entire space just on the lair, which is probably a better way to do things. Then in the future, when I get increased room sizes, I can actually make my tauren's room be to the size. Or maybe I even have the space. I guess if I go back to a empty stair, I'd have the space to make a like small sized room for my tauren to actually have their chambers. And then I get to have a more interesting layout as well. Ooh, okay. This is interesting. Big central spire. Again, that same thing of these like platforms where there's drops to down below. Lots of chains as well. Definitely gonna need to get some chains involved. I think that's a good idea. And then the frozen throne. I don't really need to look at this place, so I might as well just kill Arthas. I was actually looking at an image of this place to get inspiration. Again, you've got more circles. Big icicles, of course, the actual spire of the frozen throne itself. I don't think it would be that difficult to honestly build the frozen throne. This could essentially be made out of a bunch of different dyed cobble pieces, depending on the colors that you can get, which I might go for because it'd be kind of cool to have a miniature version of the frozen throne in my house. Okay, so after visiting a few of the more Death Knight inspired locations, I've realized a few things. Firstly, the actual best layout for this room is going to be the empty stairway I originally had. Then we can utilize the fact I had extra room budget to make side rooms to get the forge and stuff in there, while our main room we devote similarly to a throne room and a war planning table, but in a very sort of Acarus Icecrown Citadel way, where we have it suspended in the air over my apothecary area where you'll be able to look down at her lab. I think that's going to look a lot better, and I also think it's going to just generally feel cooler all around, as well as honestly maybe even taking less budget than original plans had in mind. So I'm going to go ahead and scrap all of this, hopefully for the last time, and get started on trying to make that concept work. On her funeral bier, her corpse laid for some time, until the agents of the Lich King, seeking great warriors to raise into Death Knights, who had heard tell of the story of this vicious tauren leader, found it, stole it away, and returned her to life. Now a member of the Ebon Blade, she served in much the same manner she had in life, as a brutal warrior and leader on the battlefield, carving her way through first the enemies of the Lich King, and then the forces of the Lich King when the Ebon Blade were later freed. As the years have gone on, she has on occasion pledged her axe towards the cause of the Horde, and when the time of Shadowlands came around, she was among those to invade the Maw in that ill-fated first incursion, was ultimately captured though she was not broken. Instead, she spent a great deal of time studying the domination magic that the Moorsworn used, and the runic magic of the Maldraxi, coming out of the Shadowlands with a great deal of knowledge that she then put towards forging rune blades and weapons for the Death Knight Order. So basic shape is really coming along nicely here. I was able to get these platforms looking really good. It's feeling like you get in places like Acarus and Icecrown Citadel, with this center platform that's just made out of slate cobbles. The war table is much more of a centerpiece now, with some good illumination, but all in all, it feels a lot more shape-wise interesting just on the whole, and also just generally in design and theme, it feels better. And there's still plenty of space down here, even though it dips into what would technically be this room to ultimately build the lab, which I think will look really good from above once we get to that. I'm going to add some bookshelves in the corner here. You know, similar to the Death Knight Order Hall, it also would make sense for a war planning area for there to be bookshelves. It also helps close up some of the gaps in this fencing a little bit. This bookshelf has a really nice weathered look, and while we don't have the bookshelves in the Death Knight Order Hall available, I think this is a really good in-between compromise to get that sort of creepier feel. Those bookshelves in, it's annoyingly difficult to get war resources, even having played so much BFA. Hopefully that gets changed in the future. But now I'm going to try and build the frozen throne right over here, which is going to be interesting. Obviously it won't be exactly the frozen throne, more like something inspired by it, but I'm going to give it my best shot to add to the atmosphere of this place. Now she sees less time on the battlefield as Azeroth enters a more peaceful era where the Ebon Blade are less needed, but she ever thirsts for that glory, and so she has recently taken up work as a mercenary, pledging her knowledge and expertise in battle to various causes that might have need of her, particularly in the undead circles. As the void rises in midnight, Rokara will surely turn her axe towards assisting the elves in this effort, bringing her dark magic to once more counter dark magic in turn. So I've got the throne in now, and I'm really liking how it's looking. The ambient light I was able to get by hiding this up here, and then the way that the underlighting is provided by these pyres really makes for a very eerie feel, definitely captures some of that frozen throne energy. And I'm thinking the usage of these cobbles to be ice might be something I actually implement in the rest of this build here, possibly dropping these fences to go for a more icy look, making this more ice. I think it would help with cohesion and also some of the clutter that this build has going on. So I'm going to get right to that and try and just refine this area more in general. As a person, however, Rokara is pretty brutal and cold. She was very closed off to her emotions even in life, and death has done few things to help that, only adding to her vindictive and angry nature. But for all the rage that she carries within her heart, she knows strategy often wins the day more than might, and she knows to surround herself with the right people to enable that. As a part of the Grim Totem tribe, she's a big believer in might makes right, and that the strongest should be the ones to lead. Okay, so I did some reworking, further emphasizing the frost feeling. Of course, you got cobblestone paths that have been dyed to sort of hide the wood elements of these walkways, and again, just add that icy feel. I felt like just having this fully exposed without the fences was a bit off, so I added these chunks of ice to then serve as a sort of barrier and separate this place from the rest of the build a little bit more as the central war planning area. Back here, I got rid of the overlooking forges and just made it so that the braziers are more hidden, and I think it actually works a lot better that way. You get similar ambience, but it feels less cluttered and emphasizes the throne a lot more, which you can in fact sit on, of course. And then I also went ahead and built the forge. In our research, we found that usually Death Knight places cover off areas with curtains, and this is really the best solution that I found for that. I dyed it Nazjatar Navy because it's really similar to the Ebon Blade banners, which helps with the cohesion of the whole build. And then the forge itself. It's a really simple build, but I really like how it came out nonetheless. Of course, we've got the actual Ebon Blade forge item here, but then we're again using these signal braziers, hiding them in to almost look with these trophies from the Hunter Order Hall to then sort of recreate how the forge looks in the Legion version of Acheris, where you can go inspect your artifact weapon. And I think it just makes for a really good energy of the place. And then without going too crazy or too over budget, we've got clutter around, weapons, a rack where tools would be kept, this sort of thing, which is for a bit of that Maldraxxus flash, since she did study from the Necrolords as well. And then of course this nice anvil from Wrath of the Lich King in the center. Again, more runes, and surprisingly there aren't many anvil items in the game, at least not ones that really fit the theme, and this one does it really well. I especially like when you come down here, you can see it lit from below, and this whole area framed by the curtains, but hiding some of it just makes for a very enticing build. With a final room here, and that will be for Rokara's bedroom. It's going to be interesting building a tauren bedroom. You don't really see a whole lot of those in the game. I might do a little bit of a hybrid thing, but I've got a few ideas and I'm just going to get right to it. So I may have made a mistake. I went and looked at some tauren zones and it's made me want to rework things all over again. But it's not just that. As much as I'm liking this sort of like Acheris, Icecrown Citadel direction, it's also just not quite working, and I think that's because you can't really capture a lot of that energy when you're dealing with these housing interiors that use wood. Because wood is a building material that is almost entirely absent from Acheris and the like, and so attempting to replicate that style is almost a merging and mashing of two disparate styles, and it makes this feel pretty hollow and pretty empty. So I think if I go for that tauren inspired direction, go back to what I was initially going for, just rework it a little bit, keep it a 2-story room like this because you actually get much more ceiling space by doing that. I think I'm going to be able to make something a lot better. So hopefully this will actually be the final rework, but I've really enjoyed the building process and trying out these different designs, and I hope even if we don't ultimately go with a certain design, that maybe it can inspire you and maybe it can be something that you end up using. For now, I'm just going to scrap this and we're going to get a central room reworked here. despite all of this very brutal, cold attitude, there is a more sentimental side to her. At times she does still think of her days amidst the tauren, the shamanistic practices they held. She usually tries to avoid that by throwing herself into ruthless combat so she doesn't have to think about it, but it's one of those things that haunts her in those quiet moments. So that's Rikara. She's a really fun character who I haven't got to do a whole lot with, and I'm looking forward to doing more with in the future. And I think this build has been perfectly capturing both that sentimental tauren aspect of carrying forth that glory from her old days, having trophies around that might have come from various conquests, and the Death Knight Runeforge aspect with this forge on the side, and the war planning table in the middle, and of course, our own frozen throne. I look forward to maybe hosting some war planning meetings with my guild in the future here come midnight, but that will have to wait for when the expansion is actually upon us. So we are finally, after much back and forth as you saw, done here. I was able to capture a lot more of the energy I initially was trying to go for, and I was able to avoid some of my worries about the layouts being too similar, getting the second story look in here. Obviously, this is a huge change since I last checked in, but a lot of the elements have stayed the same. We've got the same war planning table, the same throne, same sort of forge setup over here, but they've just been arranged in different ways. So I use this raised platform with these Orgrimmar interior walls to create a stony area, which was an issue I was having with this very wooden floor, to create this separated forge area, further separated out with this Forsaken War planning tent, again using some of the sort of drape separation that we saw happening in Acaris. Otherwise, it's not too different from the entirely different room that we had set up initially. Approach to the throne is a touch different. I really like the use of these banners. This is something that I saw in tauren buildings where they'd have banners hanging from upper floors, and I think this is a great spot for them. This is our like primary source of light, and it's pretty low down, but given that it's meant to be illuminating the war planning table, I think that works pretty nicely. Although really these braziers don't do a whole lot to illuminate stuff, unfortunately. Because I would have loved to get like an eerie blue feeling like I have the green down in here. But that just isn't something that's really easy to do with our current lighting system. And then of course you can sit in our makeshift frozen throne, and I think she looks great in it. In this back section, getting to get double use out of this Maldraxian rune tablet. We've got a sort of simple office. You know, she made the mistake of getting too good at her job, so now she has to do a bunch of paperwork for all the various Seven Blades stuff and her own war and mercenary efforts. So just generally Death Knight knowledge and a desk at which she can do her work. And then just some general tauren decoration. That's something I have in a few spots throughout the build. I've got it over here as well. In a lot of the tauren buildings I saw, they just will have rugs about, they'll have decoration about. It doesn't really seem too purposeful, but it does add to an overall aesthetic and feeling, which when we're trying not to escalate our budgets with a bunch of crazy builds, it helps to just throw a few smaller props around to sort of create a feel more than make a space that is truly cluttered. We reserve our clutter for higher detail areas like here in the office. But in the upstairs section, I left it rather plain, and that is very intentional because Rikara is a Death Knight, and Death Knights in my mind are living weapons. They don't really keep a whole lot of comforts, so I've just got a punching bag for her to train with, some tauren banners to sort of remember and celebrate her time as a tauren. I like to think that maybe some of these acclaimed war banners from her time as a war leader, and then a sort of bed. Looking around at tauren locations and architecture, you really don't see beds, at least not in the traditional sense. I get the sense that they sleep on mats a lot, so that's just sort of what I went for here, a nice big mat. Obviously, she's not going to be doing any sleeping, but if she ever has anyone around, probably good to have. And then this story frame, I like to think or picture that this is a story telling her sort of deeds on the battlefield and the sort, one of the trophies that she's kept from life. A few sentimental things was though Rokara is very cold and would like to portray herself as this pure warrior who's just seeking glory on the battlefield, she does have those touches of sentiment that show that she's a little bit more than that than she'd like to let on. But all in all, for how harrowing this build was, how many times I scrapped it, how much I reworked it, how long it ended up taking because of that, I'm really happy with the end result. It didn't come out how I initially envisioned it, but that's because how I initially envisioned it wasn't gonna work, and that's just how things are gonna work out sometimes. Now we have about 260 or so budget left to do what will likely for the foreseeable future until midnight ups our limits be the final room of our house down here. This will be my Forsaken Apothecary's lab. It was actually one of the first builds that I made on the housing beta, was testing it out. We've got a lot more space to work with. I've got a ton of ideas. I've been thinking over these past couple weeks what I'm going to do with this space, how I'm going to implement her story into the build, but that is obviously going to have to wait for the next episode. For now, I've been Nyx. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you then.